1994 didn't just create legends, it quietly buried careers. How did the same year that gave us unforgettable classics also produce some of Hollywood's most painful failures? Behind the hits were films with massive budgets, A-list stars, and total studio confidence that still collapsed. In this video, we're uncovering the 13 biggest box office disasters of 1994, and one of them nearly changed how Hollywood risks money forever: The Cowboy Way, 1994. At first glance, this looked like an easy win, a buddy cop formula mixed with Western swagger, backed by recognizable stars and a concept Hollywood had used successfully for years. But something felt off almost immediately. The tone couldn't decide what it wanted to be: comedy, action, or parody, and audiences sensed that confusion. But the film followed two modern cowboys navigating New York City, a fish-out-of-water premise that should have delivered humor and charm. Instead, it felt forced. Jokes landed flat. Action lacked urgency, and the chemistry between the leads never reached the energy needed to carry the film. What makes this failure more interesting is that nothing about it seemed risky on paper. This wasn't an experimental project. It was a calculated studio product. And yet, it quietly slipped through theaters with little impact, proving that even safe formulas can collapse when execution fails. The Scout, 1994. This film didn't just fail, it confused its audience into rejecting it. Marketed as a sports comedy, it quickly drifted into something far stranger. The story centered on a baseball scout who discovers a once-in-a-generation talent. But instead of a straightforward underdog story, the film leaned into psychological instability and emotional unpredictability. That tonal shift became its biggest weakness. Viewers walked in expecting humor and inspiration, but were met with a darker, almost uncomfortable character study. Word of mouth turned negative almost instantly. What makes this collapse fascinating is how quickly it happened. Within days of release, the film lost momentum, with audiences unsure how to recommend or even describe it. Studios rely heavily on clarity in marketing, and this film broke that rule completely. In the end, it became a case study in how mismatched expectations can destroy a film faster than bad acting or poor visuals ever could. I Love Trouble, 1994. On paper, this should have been a hit. A romantic comedy starring two major Hollywood names, built around a classic enemies-to-lovers formula, seemed like a guaranteed success. But behind the scenes, something was already going wrong, and it showed on screen. Reports of tension between the leads weren't just rumors. That lack of connection translated directly into the film's tone. Scenes that were supposed to feel playful instead felt strained. Dialogue lacked rhythm. The chemistry, the one thing a romantic comedy cannot survive without, simply wasn't there. Audiences noticed immediately. What should have been charming felt uncomfortable. Instead of rooting for the characters, viewers became aware of the distance between them. The deeper issue was that the film relied entirely on star power. When that foundation cracked, there was nothing underneath to hold it up. And no standout script, no fresh angle, just a familiar structure struggling to function. It didn't completely collapse financially, but compared to expectations, it was a disappointment that revealed a hard truth. Casting big names isn't enough if the connection isn't real. Blue Sky, 1994. This film's failure wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost invisible, which makes it more unsettling. Unlike many disasters driven by poor quality, this one had something rare: critical recognition. Yet somehow, it still failed at the box office. The story followed a military family dealing with emotional instability, set against the tense backdrop of Cold War-era America. The performances were strong, even award-winning, but the film itself felt trapped in limbo, delayed for years before release. It lost momentum long before audiences even had the chance to see it. By the time it arrived in theaters, the cultural moment it belonged to had already passed. Marketing was minimal, promotion was weak, and viewers simply weren't aware of its existence. What makes this case so fascinating is that it proves success isn't only about quality. Timing, visibility, and studio support matter just as much. In another timeline, this film could have been a respected drama with solid returns. Instead, it became a reminder that even strong performances can disappear if the industry fails to support them. The Pagemaster, 1994. There was something ambitious about this project. A blend of live action and animation designed to pull audiences into a world of classic literature felt like a creative risk worth taking. But ambition doesn't always translate into connection. The film followed a young boy transported into a magical library where stories came alive around him. On paper, it had all the ingredients of a family hit: fantasy, adventure, and a recognizable young star. But the execution felt uneven. The transition between live action and animation lacked fluidity. The tone shifted unpredictably between light-hearted adventure and darker, almost unsettling moments. Children didn't fully embrace it. Adults didn't feel drawn to it. And critics responded with noticeable hesitation. The biggest issue was identity. It didn't feel like a Disney-style spectacle, yet it wasn't grounded enough to appeal to older audiences either. In the end, it became one of those films that seemed promising during development, but struggled to define itself once completed. Over time, it gained a small nostalgic following, but in 1994, audiences simply weren't ready to accept it. Wyatt Earp, 1994. Timing can destroy even the most carefully planned film, and this is one of the clearest examples. A large-scale Western epic, backed by a major star and a significant budget, should have dominated attention. Instead, it arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Another Western, faster, sharper, and more accessible, had already captured audiences. By the time this film released, viewers felt like they had already seen the story. But timing wasn't the only issue. The film leaned heavily into historical detail, stretching its runtime into something far longer than most audiences were willing to sit through. What was meant to feel immersive instead felt exhausting. Scenes unfolded slowly. What momentum struggled to build, and viewers began to disconnect. What makes this failure particularly striking is how much effort went into making it authentic. The scale, the costumes, the performances, all pointed toward prestige. Yet prestige alone doesn't guarantee engagement. Audiences weren't rejecting Westerns. They were rejecting this version of one. It stands as a reminder that even a well-crafted film can fail if it misunderstands what audiences want at that exact moment. The Swan Princess, 1994. Animation in the early 1990s was entering a powerful new era. Audiences were expecting emotional depth, memorable music, and groundbreaking visuals. Against that rising standard, this film struggled to compete. At its core, the story followed a classic fairy tale structure: romance, transformation, and magical conflict. It had all the familiar elements that had worked for decades. But something was missing. The emotional connection never fully formed. The characters felt distant. The music, while present, didn't leave a lasting impression. And visually, it couldn't match the level audiences were beginning to expect from animated features at the time. What makes this more painful is that it wasn't a careless production. Effort was clearly there, but it entered a market that had already shifted forward, and it couldn't keep up. Families had choices, and they chose films that felt bigger, more polished, and more emotionally engaging. Over time, the film found appreciation through home viewing and nostalgia. But during its theatrical run, it simply couldn't compete with the new standard of animated storytelling. Sometimes, failure isn't about being bad, it's about being outpaced. Street Fighter, 1994. This film represents a different kind of failure, one where financial results don't tell the full story. On the surface, it made money, but beneath that surface, something else was happening. Based on a massively popular video game, expectations were high. Fans wanted a faithful, exciting adaptation. Instead, they received a film that felt disconnected from its source. The tone leaned heavily into exaggerated camp. Characters felt more like caricatures than real people. And the story struggled to maintain coherence, jumping between moments without clear direction. For general audiences, it was entertaining in a chaotic way, but for fans, it felt like a missed opportunity. Critics responded harshly, and pointing out the lack of structure and emotional grounding. And while the film performed well enough globally, it damaged confidence in video game adaptations for years. What makes this case fascinating is how it reveals a gap between short-term success and long-term impact. Financially, it survived. Creatively, it failed. And that creative failure shaped how studios approached similar projects in the future. The Shadow, 1994. Before modern superhero films defined the box office, there were earlier attempts to bring comic-inspired characters to life. This was one of them, and it arrived with significant expectations. The character itself had a long history, rooted in radio dramas and pulp storytelling. The film aimed to modernize that legacy, combining dark atmosphere with large-scale production. Visually, it succeeded in moments. The set design, costumes, and tone captured a sense of mystery. But the narrative struggled to hold everything together. Audiences found it difficult to connect with the character. The story felt distant, almost inaccessible. And without that emotional anchor, the spectacle wasn't enough. Marketing built anticipation, but the final product didn't deliver the clarity or excitement viewers expected. What makes this failure stand out is that it arrived just before the superhero genre found its modern identity. In another era, with different storytelling techniques, it might have succeeded. Instead, it became part of a transitional phase, an example of Hollywood still trying to understand how to adapt larger-than-life characters for the screen. Color of Night, 1994. Some films fail quietly, and others become known for the wrong reasons. This one did both. Positioned as a psychological thriller with bold themes and high intensity, it aimed to pull audiences into a world of mystery, danger, and emotional instability. On paper, the concept had everything it needed: secrets, layered characters, and a central puzzle built around a therapist drawn into the lives of his patients. But execution changed everything. Instead of carefully building suspense, the film drifted into confusion. Plot twists appeared without proper setup. Key revelations lacked clarity. Character motivations shifted in ways that felt inconsistent rather than complex. What should have created tension instead created distance between the film and its audience. That gap between intention and result became impossible to ignore. The film clearly wanted to feel daring, unpredictable, and psychologically gripping. But viewers struggled to take it seriously. Moments designed to shock or surprise often felt disconnected, as if they belonged to a different story altogether. Critical reception focused heavily on its lack of coherence. Reviewers pointed out that while individual elements showed promise, they never came together into a satisfying whole. Audiences responded similarly, leading to a steady loss of engagement. The film didn't completely disappear. It gained attention for certain controversial or memorable moments, but not in the way the studio intended. This is the kind of failure where ambition outpaces control. The pieces exist, but they never align. And when a thriller loses its ability to engage, the entire structure begins to collapse, just leaving behind a film that feels incomplete rather than impactful. North, 1994. This was supposed to be a light-hearted family film, something imaginative and emotionally resonant. Instead, it became one of the most criticized releases of its time. The premise alone was unusual. A young boy decides to divorce his parents and travels across the world searching for a better family. It was bold, even risky, and that originality initially set it apart. But as the story unfolded, that boldness turned into its greatest weakness. Rather than building a cohesive emotional journey, the film moved from one location to another in a series of loosely connected segments. Each new setting introduced different characters, tones, and situations, making the narrative feel fragmented instead of continuous. While this structure made it difficult for audiences to stay invested. Just as viewers began to understand one environment, the story shifted again, removing any sense of stability or emotional progression. The result felt less like a complete story and more like a collection of disconnected ideas. The deeper issue was emotional grounding. A film centered on family, belonging, and identity should have created a strong emotional connection. Instead, it felt distant and strangely artificial. The heart of the story never fully formed, leaving audiences unsure of what they were meant to feel. Critics responded quickly and strongly, highlighting the lack of focus and emotional clarity. Audience reactions followed the same pattern, leading to a rapid decline in interest after release. And what makes this failure particularly striking is how quickly perception changed. What began as a unique concept turned into a clear example of how experimentation, without structure, can push audiences away rather than draw them in. Radioland Murders, 1994. Speed became this film's greatest weakness. Designed as a fast-paced comedy mystery set during the early days of radio broadcasting, it leaned heavily on rapid dialogue, overlapping conversations, and constant movement. The goal was obvious: create non-stop energy, overwhelm the senses, and keep the audience engaged from the very first scene. On paper, that approach sounded exciting. In execution, it became exhausting. Instead of building tension, the relentless pacing worked against the story. Scenes moved so quickly that viewers struggled to understand what was happening, let alone why it mattered. Key plot points passed by in seconds. Jokes were delivered and gone before they had time to land. Characters entered the story with exaggerated personalities, only to disappear before any real connection could form. The setting itself had real potential. A single chaotic night inside a radio station, with live broadcasts colliding with unexpected events, could have created a tight, suspenseful experience. There was an opportunity for controlled chaos, where every moment builds toward something meaningful. But here, the chaos wasn't controlled. It flooded the narrative, drowning out clarity and focus. Audience reactions reflected that imbalance. Instead of feeling entertained, many felt overwhelmed. The film demanded constant attention, but offered little reward for keeping up. Word of mouth faded almost instantly, and interest dropped within days of release. This stands as a rare example where energy becomes a liability. When a film refuses to slow down, it removes the audience's ability to process, connect, and care. And without that connection, even the most energetic story can quickly fall apart. The Specialist, 1994. This was meant to be a major event, an explosive, high-budget action thriller built around two of the biggest stars of the era, positioned as a guaranteed box office powerhouse. The marketing promised intensity, danger, and unforgettable chemistry. And in some ways, it delivered, at least financially. Audiences showed up, tickets were sold, and on paper, it looked like a success. But beneath that surface, something wasn't working. The film centered on revenge, control, and destruction, blending large-scale action sequences with emotional tension. Explosions, surveillance, and calculated vengeance formed the backbone of the story. Yet the balance between spectacle and storytelling never fully aligned. Scenes that should have built suspense instead slowed the momentum. Emotional moments felt disconnected from the action. The tone shifted unpredictably, making it difficult for viewers to stay immersed. What makes this case particularly fascinating is the gap between expectation and perception. This wasn't a small film struggling to find its audience. It was a major release that had everything in its favor. Star power, budget, and visibility were all in place. But audience reactions told a different story. And people watched it, but they didn't fully connect with it. Critics pointed to its lack of depth and narrative clarity. Viewers sensed that something essential was missing: an emotional core, a sense of purpose, a reason to care beyond the spectacle. Over time, it became less remembered as a hit and more as a missed opportunity. And sometimes, that kind of quiet disappointment leaves a deeper mark than outright failure.